Hi, this is Dr. Morgan, and this is the first lecture in our course, Chinese Art and Culture. We call the course Chinese Art and Culture, but really we're talking about Chinese civilization as a whole. The reason for this is that we have to look at history in particular in pretty good detail to really understand the context of Chinese art and culture. China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. It's not just a nation, it's a civilization unto itself, and it stretches back thousands of years. So to understand this culture, we have to understand the historical precedents and the historical processes and people that helped shape it. So in this course, we're going to look at philosophy, we're going to look at political developments, particularly the development of the imperial system, and we're going to look at how the traditional Chinese value systems helped develop that imperial system into a political system that lasted around 2,000 years. So very, very, very successful by historical standards. So when we begin our discussion of Chinese civilization, it's difficult to know where to start. We can go all the way back to antiquity with the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty. Instead, we're going to begin with the Qin dynasty. This is the first truly imperial Chinese dynasty. It is the period when weights and measures were standardized, when a common script was developed throughout China, and it's the period where centralized control is developed over the entire civilization. So the Qin dynasty is very interesting. It was based on the conquest of the state of Qin in the northwest of the country. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, conquered the rest of the warring states and instituted what was basically a totalitarian system of government. You can see here in the picture the terracotta army. These were terracotta soldiers carved to guard the tomb of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. Qin Shi Huangdi had his entire honor guard carved for this purpose. If you look at the faces on these thousands of soldiers, you'll see that each one is unique. That's because they're all based off of a real soldier in his army. The philosophy of legalism was the intellectual foundation for the Qin state, the great Qin army that unified China and created the first united Chinese empire that spanned all of what we call China proper, the territory in China in which ethnically Chinese people live. And we'll talk more about that at a later time. Legalism was based on the rule of law. It was based on the idea that human beings are fallen, and not fallen in the Christian sense, in the sense of fallen through sin. We're naturally brutish. We're naturally animalistic. If left to our own devices, we will rob, rape, and kill. And therefore, the way to control human behavior and have an orderly society is through a very, very, very strict and impartial system of rewards and punishments. And these could be very, very harsh. For example, if you had a neighbor who was saying things against the ruler, well, you could report your neighbor to the ruler and you'd get a reward. You would get, one person received a lot of salted pork and alcohol as part of the reward for turning in his neighbor. Of course, the neighbor would be put to death for sedition, for speaking against the ruler. If you were a government worker and you showed up late to work, you could be put to death. So it's very, very strict, and it was designed to compel the people into total obedience. And the ruler himself didn't have to live by this system. He was the only one who was exempt, but everyone else underneath him did. This system was crafted by a number of thinkers, foremost among them Yang. You can see his picture there. He was one of the great philosophers of this time period that we're soon going to be talking about, the Warring States, out of which the Qin developed. Just on a side note, when you look in the news talking about North Korea, many people will be surprised when they ask me about North Korea, and I tell them, well, North Korea isn't really communist. It's got communist dressing on it, but the system is legalist. You have this all-powerful totalitarian ruler who's essentially worshipped as a divine being, and he controls every aspect of life. The proletariat, the dialectic, all of that is secondary, and it's really just the dressing that goes over a legalist society. And of course, it's very brutal. Not to say that those elements that are, in fact, communist are not brutal themselves. They very much are. Communism being being the deadliest system of government ever devised. So Xiangyang developed the legalist system in the context of the Warring States. This was a period after the Zhou dynasty in which China split into, at first, a couple hundred, and then later on 12 or so, coalescing into 12 or so major states. And these were independent states, more or less, that battled one another on a consistent basis. Now, this period was very, very violent. This is the period where the crossbow, which had been invented in China around the beginning of this period, the crossbow began to be used to great effect. Imagine, and the strength of the crossbow is that unlike a bow where you pull the string, it takes very little skill. An actual bow takes sometimes even years of training to master, whereas a crossbow, you can hand a peasant a crossbow and you can teach him how to fire it in half a day. And so if you have 10,000 of these peasants armed with crossbows, you have a very formidable force. So this made conflict much more bloody. Previously, when there were battles, you would have commanders and other members of the nobility come out and fight these very stylized, ceremonious duels. Sometimes there would be deaths, not always. With the advent of kind of mass warfare and the crossbow on the battlefield, the battlefield became much more lethal. And of course, this also happened in Europe when the crossbow finally made its way all the way to Europe in the 11th and 12th centuries. The church actually attempted to ban the crossbow because they saw it as destructive to human life. But this was the context, this very violent period of time in which you had all of these different local leaders kind of doing their own thing, regardless of the effect on society. You had hundreds of thousands of people being massacred, crops being destroyed, entire villages of peasants being slaughtered, and it was a period of great chaos. And the great philosophers of the time wanted to figure out how they could prevent this from continuing. How do we solve this problem? How do we ensure that human beings behave? And of course, for the legalists, for Xiangyang, the answer to that was a strong system of rewards and punishments based off a kind of absolute law, in which the government is very strong, very powerful, and very disciplinarian. And so this helped the Qin. They had a very disciplined society in the sense that the people farmed, they were tough, they made excellent soldiers, and when the Qin, at first the dukes and then later the kings of Qin, began to conquer the other states, they built an unstoppable military machine, which was represented by those terracotta warriors we saw just then. They used chariots. They had chariots with archers on them, chariots with lancers on them. They used cavalry. They used foot soldiers with spears, with shields, swords, crossbows, etc. And these Qin soldiers were expertly trained in this. They had to be, as a citizen of Qin. The spiritual and intellectual successor of Xiangyang was Li Se. You have the minister, a stylized portrait of Li Se here. Li Se was a minister of the state of Qin, and he was a legalist like Xiangyang, and he wanted to more thoroughly inundate the state with legalist principles. He believed in equality, and it was a very different sense of equality than what we might look at today. He believed that all people should be equally weak before the ruler. The ruler has all of the power, he has all of the prestige, and you don't have these intermediate levels of society. You don't have a nobility or kind of a wealthy class. You have everyone in complete and total submission to the ruler. And of course, going back to North Korea, talking about the North Korean system, this again is a legalist idea. The idea that the their leader has complete and total control over society, and government officials are just irreplaceable. You can think about the official whom Kim Jong-un had executed, his uncle, I think it was, had him basically pulled apart by dogs. And they had another government official, he was blown apart by an anti-aircraft gun as part of his execution. He didn't survive that, obviously. So this is a legalist principle in action, and Lisa wanted to fully inundate the Qin system with this, so that the Qin would be able to continue conquering the land.